is divine. The Stoics spoke of nature as providence. In that fashion, Spinoza tends to transmit, he does transmit, to the 19th century. He's, remember, in the 17th century. But he's the link that transmits that monistic kind of approach, a pantheistic kind of approach, a nature pantheism, to the 19th century Romanticists. And when we get to the 19th century, we'll see how some of them, like Hegel and Schleiermacher, speak very favorably of Spinoza and what he had done. And if you're acquainted with 19th century Romanticist literature, you may be aware of the way in which people like Coleridge and Goethe, Matthew Arnold, are very favorably inclined towards Spinoza. So he is the historical link in transmitting a nature pantheism to the 19th century Romanticists. Okay. Now, of course, they weren't rationalists like he is. Far from it. They didn't develop an ethic of reason controlling the emotions. Far from it. But it's the nature pantheism which they transmit, which they continue. So that's the second kind of thing, modifications and continuities with regards to Descartes' own position and what he transmits to later on. Now, that immediately leads to a third kind of historical importance, the influence of his rationalistic critique of traditional religion, in his case, traditional Judaism. He's sometimes cited in courses on biblical criticism as one of the originators of historical criticism of the Old Testament literature. He published in 1670 a work entitled the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, a political theological tract, essay, Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, in which, for instance, he denies that there is any specially revealed truth. Now, why would a rationalistic pantheist say that? Well, you see, if you have confidence in this mathematical kind of method, then it should be possible to infer the total body of accessible truth from given axioms by reason alone, you see. So the sufficiency of the method. But for a pantheist, any special kind of divine act of self-revelation is meaningless. Because if there is no being outside of God, what would it mean for God to act to some being in a self-revealing way? What you get in a pantheistic scheme is what is often called an immanentistic theology. That is to say, if everything is God and God is everything, then everything that is ascribed to God is simply going on within God not to the outside of God, but going on within God, you see. And insofar as things are going on in nature, thanks to God, it's because God is in nature and nature is in God, and the totality of the being. And so there can be no such thing as special divine revelation. For a pantheist, it's both unnecessary and impossible. Religion, therefore, for Spinoza, reduces to right living. So his kind of Judaism would be analogous to what today is thought of as Reformed Judaism, which is a religious humanism valuing the values, the moral concerns of historic Judaism without the supernaturalist theology of Orthodox Judaism. Because of that, in turn, the role of religious symbols changes. Religious language and religious rites are no longer descriptive or reminders of a traditional God and his mighty acts. They are simply symbols that tend to bind the community together. They have communitarian values. They bind the community together and provide imaginative language, the language of story, the language of heritage, which unites the community around certain moral ideals. And that is a theme which is getting a lot of emphasis in our own day. Narrative theology, for instance, has some connections with this. If you're interested in pursuing this kind of influence in 19th century theology, we'll say more about it second semester, but there is a very worthwhile book by C.C.J. Webb, a book entitled A Study of Religious Thought in England from 1850. A study of religious thought in England from 1850. And all I'll say about that at this stage is that that will give you some contact with the kinds of religious thought which are influenced by Spinoza's rationalist critique of traditional religion. Okay? Well, those three things about historical importance. Any comments, questions, reruns, places where you blinked and want to be filled in? Yeah, Bob.
I was wondering, are you saying that Spinoza is a strict pantheist in every sense of the word?
Yeah, I think that's so. Does that raise some problem?
Okay, it didn't seem like you were completely saying that he was definite.
Oh, okay, maybe I was being too gracious. Maybe I said he tended towards rather than he outright is. Okay, well, he outright is, quite explicitly. Yeah. I think that'll become very plain as we go ahead. Janelle? Well, again, I'm inclined to say wait and see for a few moments until we get down there. Now, the few moments may be Friday, so don't hold your breath too long. Okay. David?
You mentioned how Descartes and Spinoza are so different, but they share the same ethic. Rather than following Janelle's question, I'm wondering if you can jump back to Descartes.
Okay. Yeah, let me see if I can reconstruct briefly, for the benefit of the not-so-faithful remnant, what we did with Descartes last Wednesday. The way I summed it up was this. We were talking about Descartes' theory of the passions. Now, I don't want to go back into that now, but check what Stumpf has to say about Descartes on the emotions and passions. His theory of the passions is such that they mislead us by virtue of lack of clarity which accompanies emotion. Consequently, when the mind achieves clarity and distinctness of thought, clear and distinct ideas, you see, that confusion that goes with emotion is dispelled, and the power of the passion is broken. Okay? So it's clarity of mind. Now, before you dismiss that, ask yourself what it is that the psychological counselor, perhaps the analyst, does in trying to get you to remember something or to think more clearly about the circumstances in which such and such happened, you see. Trying to dispel the emotion by means of clarity of thought. So that's the sort of thing which he sees. Now, at the same time, pull into that his discussion of will and intellect, Descartes' discussion of will and intellect. Because what he says in that regards about error, he says with regards to a will that jumps the gun ahead of the intellect, but a will which needs to be restrained to making judgments about what it knows. Now, error is a cognitive kind of evil. So how then are we going to restrain ourselves from evil? But by restraining the will, for Descartes, restraining the will within the limits of what we know with clarity and distinctness to be good. And so you have the same sort of thing. Similarly, with regards to mind and body, inasmuch as the mind is a separate substance from body, and passions are physically caused. The fact that the mind is separate means that it need not be subject to deterministic kinds of causation from bodily passions. But the mind, by its clarity and distinctness, can assert its independence and again the same conclusion results. And then the fourth thing I noted was that in his discourse on method,